Welcome back to Real Talk with Brian and Dan on 1150 KKNW. I'm Brian.
I'm Dan.
Our next guest is Scott Milburn with Advocates Law Group, PLLC. Scott is an entrepreneurial attorney and senior business executive who brings a unique combination of legal and business experience to his clients. He began his career in the Justice Department in 1981, and he has been in private practice in the Seattle area since 1985. Doing business and real estate law, Scott has also spent several decades in business positions in early-stage technology companies, and he continues to provide part-time business assistance to startups. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So tell us, what are you doing when you're not practicing law?
Well, let's see. Tasting and collecting good wine.
Nice. There you go.
Cooking. Going to Maui every couple months.
Okay.
A couple months, nice.
So those kinds of things.
You got a favorite local winery?
A number of them. DeLille is certainly one of my favorites.
DeLille's a good one, yeah.
But there are a lot of good ones out in Woodman, and go down to Walla Walla, too.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Awesome. So we like to ask our guests, since this is a show about real estate, but it's a show about living in homes, tell us about the home you grew up in.
So I grew up in a suburb of Washington, D.C., right across the river from D.C., and it was an old two-story typically brick homes back there. And one memory I have of it is there was an oak tree in the side yard that was, to me, felt like it was 500 feet tall.
Huh.
And I used to climb up it, so I would climb up to the peak of the roof, like a two-story house plus roof. I was actually climbing up to about the peak of the roof, which was pretty exciting.
Pretty high,
sure.
yeah.
You know, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah, but that's what trees are for,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
Yeah. I actually remember climbing up in the back of my neighbor's house. He had an evergreen tree, so we climbed to the top of one of those.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Right.
that was great. Thank God nobody fell. But you know,
Thank God your parents didn't see you.
yeah, they didn't know. So irresponsible. DHS
Yeah,
probably be out there
exactly.
taking me away if they did.
So today we're talking about the fundamentals of starting a business. When does someone need a legal entity for their business?
Well, there could be a variety of reasons. It could be it makes them seem more professional, depending on the nature of their business. There could be tax or financial benefits of having a legal entity as opposed to operating as a sole proprietor. The biggest one typically, though, is protection from liability. So, for example, if you're buying a rental home, if you buy it in your own name, if something happens, I mean, somebody could get hurt and claim that it's because you weren't maintaining the house properly, and they sue, they're suing you personally, and it goes after all your assets. Whereas if you have a legal entity like an LLC and it's properly managed, all they can get to is the assets of the entity, which would be the equity in the home.
So that's an interesting. The second part of what you said, I think, is the most important, and it's run properly.
And it's run properly, yes.
Yeah, because I see it. I mean, Brian, you and I see it a lot of times. There's LLCs all across the board for ownership. Right. So do you mind if we go into that? What does it look like to run it properly?
So there's a mistake that a lot of people make is that anybody can go on the Secretary of State's website, and in 15 minutes, $200, you've got an LLC.
Yep.
If that's all you do, if there's a lawsuit down the road, a judge could say, you did that, but you didn't do anything else, so we're going to ignore it because you ignored it. So some of the steps that need to be taken are there have to be a set of documents created at the time you create the LLC, like an operating agreement. Even if you're the only member, you have to have an annual meeting every year, and it seems kind of silly, but type up a paragraph or two of minutes of the meeting. Keep a separate bank account. If you use personal money for the LLC, you do it just like you do with any other business where you submit an expense report and get reimbursed. So it's really keeping the separation between the business and you personally.
See, I think that right there is more important than obviously you have to do the entity, but probably people just spend money on repairs or whatever, and that's was it called pierce the veil of
exactly
of protection there that's created by not following the rules of an LLC as a separate entity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So say someone's buying a rental. Most lenders, if they're obtaining a loan, they don't want to lend to an LLC. So what's the process? Is it a matter of buying the home and then transferring it into the LLC?
Well, so some lenders are familiar with people buying with an LLC, particularly if it's going to be a rental property business. Right. So, I mean, there is that, and oftentimes they may require a personal guarantee of the individual. So at least as to that would have them protected from liability for a lawsuit, but they're still personally liable on the mortgage.
Sure, of course.
But your suggestion about do you buy it and then transfer it, possibly, but an issue with that is technically if I buy a house in my own name and then I transfer it to my LLC, that is a sale. And that typically will trigger a due on sale clause.
Yeah.
So even in a situation where the lender is amenable to that, if somebody owns a rental property in their own name and they decide I should put it into an LLC, they should check with their lender first and make sure the lender's going to say, yeah, okay, no problem.
Sure. That makes
Interesting. Okay. So let's go to business types. What type of business entities are there, and why should somebody choose one over another?
So the typical ones that people would look at are a limited liability company, an LLC, like we've been talking about, or a corporate for-profit corporation. There are also nonprofit corporations and professional service corporations or professional limited liability companies for people in a learned profession, if you will. Typically, for most people, an LLC is the way to go. It's easier to form. It's easier to manage than a corporation. Corporations become important if it's a type of business where you're going to get investors or want to have stock options, things like that. So for most people, an LLC would be the way to go if they want a business.
So what about an S corporation?
So you hear people talking about, oh, I have an S corporation.
Right.
There's actually no such animal as an S corporation. Under state law, there's just a corporation.
Oh, interesting.
What an S corporation means is that they have made an election with the IRS to be taxed in a specific type of way. So you can be, if you just form an LLC or a corporation, you get taxed one way, but if you make this S election with the IRS, it's taxed differently.
So it's a tax election, not a corporate.
Yeah,
election.
it's not a legal entity. There's
Gotcha.
just a corporation. But you always say that, oh, I have an S corporation. So,
Right. And it's just how you're electing. You get taxed,
Right.
which is what?
you get taxed as a partnership instead of as a corporation, which potentially has tax benefits, but that's a CPA question, so I'm not going to get into that.
Gotcha.
It depends.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends.
That's our CPA.
That's our
exactly.
CPA joke.
Yeah.
It depends.
Oh, so you asked the S corporation one. All right. So what do entrepreneurs often overlook when they start a business?
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about properly forming and managing the entity. It's people do think, oh, I can form it and then I'm set. I've got this entity, and they overlook getting all the proper documentation done and maintaining and having the separate bank account. And even something seems as silly again as printing out the formation documents on paper and getting a little 3-ring binder and keeping that, because then you can walk into court if you have to and say, here's my corporate record book.
Right.
So people overlook getting all those fundamentals done.
Well, Scott, do you handle those fundamentals for people?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So essentially, you could do the record-keeping book, or
Well,
just
so I like typically what I'll do if somebody wants to form an LLC is I'll do the registration with the state, but also create that initial set of documents for them. I give them a memo that says here are the things you need to do going forward, so they have the instructions and they know how to manage it properly.
okay.
Is there anything additional to do if there's more than one owner of the business?
One thing that's very important is having what's called a buy-sell agreement or a shareholder agreement that basically says if you and I are in business together, if one of us moves to Florida or whatever and wants out of the business, how do we go about doing that? So if you don't have that, you get into a fight at that time. If you have it, you say, I'm leaving. Here's our agreement. Here's the formula. Boom, we're done.
So is that where the shotgun clause goes?
Shotgun clause is typically part of that. Yeah.
Okay.
So
You want to
what's-
expand on that
Yeah,
for our
what's the
listeners?
story behind the shotgun
So
clause?
a shotgun clause is kind of like the old adage about how do you split up a big steak between two of you? One cuts it and the other one gets to pick.
Yeah.
Got
So the shotgun clause basically says, I go to my partner and I say, I think this business is worth $1 million. So I'll buy you out for $500,000, or you can buy me out for $500,000. And my partner then says, I actually think it's worth $1 million too, so I'll take that deal. Or I actually think it's only worth $800,000, so I will sell to you. So that's the shotgun clause.
Okay, but what's the history behind that? Do we know?
You know, I actually
There's
have.
gotta be some
I actually
obscure
looked at that
story, right?
recently, and it's one of those things where it's kind of an old wives' tale, and there's no clear explanation of where it came from. But it is an interesting story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So, what are the biggest? Did I ask that one? What the biggest
Well,
mistakes?
it goes. Yeah, it's along with it's all that not getting everything done properly, not
Okay.
managing it properly.
Okay. And then, all right. So, if a business is going to have people working for it, how do they know if the people are employees or independent contractors?
So there's no clear dividing line, but the basic primary rule is if you, the business owner, are controlling how they do their job, telling them you do that this way, this way, this way. If you're controlling them, they're an employee. If you just say this needs to be done, go do it, they're more likely to be an independent contractor. Those differences obviously have significant differences for things like taxes. Do you have to do withholding? Do you have to pay Social Security on their wages
them,
or L&I,
right.
that sort of thing?
Okay.
So I've heard there's a new law regarding non-compete agreements. What's going on with that? Is it law or is it like case law? Or?
It's actually a new the legislature passed a set of statutes that went into effect January 1st that severely restricted the ability of a company to require a non-compete or use a non-compete with employees. So, for example, there used to be no real restrictions on it other than had to be reasonable. But now you cannot have a non-compete with an employee who makes less than $100,000 a year. You can't have one with an independent contractor who makes less than $200,000 a year. There has to be a provision that if they get separated, you're going to pay them severance for the length of the non-compete period.
Oh, interesting.
Which is a big difference.
That's a big deal.
And the significant factor is it probably applies to old agreements from last year or years before.
Yeah.
And if a business today tries to enforce one of those agreements in a way that violates the new law, they could be subject to a bunch of penalties. So people need to be careful about those.
So it's interesting. I look at like Dan and I, we're not so concerned about one of our, say, a buyer broker leaving and going independent. In fact, we help them, do that. What we don't want them to do is take our client list. So does that prohibit a business from protecting like a client list?
Well, the business can still protect its confidential information, its proprietary information. So you can't prevent them from competing, but you can have like a non-disclosure agreement, things like that can prevent them from using.
They can't take
taking
the client list
with them. Yeah,
interesting.
You can also still have a non-solicitation provision that says that they can't start a new brokerage and come back and solicit your client.
That's like a confidentiality agreement.
Yeah,
right?
basically.
Like this is our information
Yeah.
and it's confidential. So I alluded to this at the beginning of the show. Why is it important? What's going on with the date and writing the date on contracts? Because I said it was the 1920s, right?
Right.
Bingo.
So this year, and this year only until 101 years from now, it's an interesting little phenomena. Last year, today's January 22nd. So last year, you would write, typically we would, in a shorthand, we'd write 1/22/19, the short for 2019.
Right.
If you write this year for today, if you wrote 1/22/20 on any sort of a legal type document, somebody could come along and add a 10 or a 15 or a 19
whatever year
after
they
that,
want.
and they could say, "Oh, you actually wrote that in 2010, not 2020." So it's important if you're talking about a check, a government form, a contract, anything that could have legal significance. It's important for this year until December 31st to write whatever 2020. Yeah.
It was funny because I posted that little factoid early January, and a lot of people commented on my post. They were like, "Well, why is that important? I don't quite understand. How could somebody?" It's like, you don't understand. You don't think like a criminal.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not you guys are all like, that doesn't make. How would that be advantage? No, somebody would figure out some way to make
actually
it
not necessarily even a criminal per se, but for example, in Washington, if you want to sue somebody on a written contract, you have 6 years to do it.
Right.
So if you have a contract that you sign in 2020, you could get sued until 2026. But if somebody backdates that contract to 2012, it's like, hey, you missed your 6 years.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Thank you for coming on the show today.
Sure.
Scott, how do listeners get a hold of you?
My law firm website is Advocates. So it's Advocates Law Group. It's advocateslg.com.
Okay.
And my phone number is 206-890-0491.
Do you have any special offers for our listeners?
Happy to do a free 15-minute consultation on any sort of legal issue that I might be able to help with.
Well, thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Appreciate it. So remember that all segments of our show are available to watch on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about any of our guests, please subscribe. Join us after the break for some final thoughts and something fun to do. We'll be right back.